January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. The war in the Pacific was burning toward its end, but for Major Frank T. McCoy, that morning felt like the beginning of a mystery. The sun struck the metal skin of the abandoned aircraft before him, a Mitsubishi G4M, Medi bomber, tail number 760B12, and the reflection shimmered like a secret, refusing to stay buried. McCoy's hands trembled as he lifted his camera. This wasn't wreckage. It wasn't a shot-down husk dragged from the jungle. The bomber sat upright on its landing gear, intact, as if it had just taxied in from a mission and stopped mid-breath. He stepped closer, tracing the fuselage with his eyes, long, perfectly cylindrical, almost elegant. The Allied pilots who fought against it had called it the flying cigar, both for its shape and the way it erupted into flames when hit. But now, standing beside one in pristine condition, McCoy couldn't understand why. As commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, McCoy had seen the insides of dozens of captured Japanese aircraft. He thought he knew what to expect, until he pried open the access panels in the wings. Inside, his disbelief turned to horror. No armor plating, no rubber seals, no self-sealing tanks, nothing, just paper-thin aluminum walls, separating thousands of liters of fuel from open air and enemy fire. It was suicide in metal form. And yet, this was Japan's most important bomber, a machine that had terrorized the Pacific for years. McCoy knew immediately, this wasn't a flaw, it was a philosophy. The unprotected fuel tanks told a story more shocking than any intelligence report. They revealed why Japanese aircraft could fly so far, why they struck from distances no one thought possible, and why so few of their crews ever came home. As McCoy photographed every inch of the plane, he wasn't just documenting enemy technology. He was staring at the embodiment of an entire nation's wartime mindset, a mindset where range mattered more than survival, and speed mattered more than life. That day at Clark Field, the Americans didn't just capture a bomb. They uncovered a secret about how Japan had built its air power, and how that same philosophy was leading it, unavoidably, to destruction. Major McCoy's reports spread through Allied intelligence channels. Like a shockwave, at first, engineers and pilots refused to believe it. How could Japan's main bomber, the aircraft that had dominated the Pacific skies in 1941 and 1942, be built this way? The diagrams didn't lie. The photographs didn't lie. The fuel tanks of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty were nothing more than aluminum boxes, holding nearly 5,000 liters of high-octane gasoline. No sealant, no armor, no protection at all. To American and British engineers, this was madness. But to Japanese designers, it was logic, brutal, cold, and terrifyingly consistent. In Tokyo, almost 8 years earlier, that logic had taken root. Japan's military planners faced a vast, oceanic chessboard, stretching from the home islands to the far edges of the Pacific. They needed an aircraft that could reach across that board in a single stroke, to strike airfields, fleets, and fortresses thousands of kilometers away, without refueling. They didn't need survivability, they needed The bomber that could achieve such range didn't exist. Not in Japan, not anywhere in the world. To create it, something fundamental had to be sacrificed. And so, in 1937, a quiet revolution began inside Mitsubishi's design bureau, a redefinition of what a bomber should be. Western aircraft designers built bombers to survive. Japanese designers built bombers to arrive. The difference was subtle, but lethal. When McCoy and his engineers studied the Betty's blueprints, they began to understand the cruel math behind the machine. Every kilogram mattered. Every bolt, every wire, every drop of fuel was weighed against the single question that had guided its creation. How far can it fly? Adding armor? That cut range. Self-sealing tanks? That cut range. Fire suppression? More weight? Less range. The Betty's creators didn't ignore protection out of ignorance. They discarded it deliberately. They accepted that every extra mile of range was bought with the lives of the men who flew it. And it worked for a time. The early months of the war proved the logic sound. The Betty struck American and British positions from distances Allied commanders thought impossible. They appeared from nowhere, dropped their bombs and vanished before defenders could even scramble fighters. But that same philosophy carried a hidden doom. When the balance of power shifted, when radar networks spread, and American fighters filled the skies, the very traits that made the Betty so formidable turned into a death sentence. As McCoy wrote in his final analysis, the Betty is not poorly built. It is perfectly built for a doctrine that values performance over protection. Its danger lies not in its design flaws, but in its design intent. In the flickering light of Clark Field's hangar, McCoy looked at the silent aircraft one last time. He understood now. This wasn't just a bomber. It was a philosophy made of metal, sleek, efficient, and doomed. The story of the Betty began, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Air Bureau in 1937. The Pacific was already a vast, restless chessboard, and Japan's admirals could see the game that was coming. They needed a bomber that could strike across oceans, one that could reach an enemy fleet or airfield before the enemy even knew it was in danger. The specifications they issued were breathtaking in their ambition. A top speed of nearly 400 kilometers per hour, a range of over 4,000 kilometers, and the ability to carry an 800-kilogram payload, all in a twin-engine aircraft. No bomber in the world could do that then. Not the American B-17, not the British Wellington. What they were asking for bordered on the impossible. And yet at Mitsubishi's design bureau in Nagoya, one man decided to make the impossible real. Kiro Honjo, a soft-spoken engineer with steel behind his eyes, had studied aircraft construction in Germany. At Junkers, he understood the mathematics of flight better than most of his generation. To him, the Navy's demands were not insane. They were a challenge that would define his life. Honjo gathered his engineers and began to strip the bomber concept down to its bones. Every gram of weight was an enemy. Every ounce of excess was a crime against range. Armor? Gone. Redundant systems? Gone. Self-sealing fuel tanks? Too heavy? Gone. Fire suppression? Too complicated? Gone. They replaced safety with fuel, protection with distance. What emerged on the drafting tables looked unlike anything else in the world. Slender, smooth, built like a blade. When the first prototype flew on October 23, it astonished the test pilots. The bomber was fast, light, responsive. It handled like a fighter, not a heavy aircraft. Its range shattered expectations. The Navy gave it an official name, Type 1 Attack Bomber. To the Allies, it would become known as the Betty. By the time Japan struck Pearl Harbor, more than 100 Bettys were ready for combat. Their moment came the next day, December 8, 1941, when 82 G4Ms roared off the runways of Formosa, heading south toward the Philippines. Their target, Clark Field, the beating heart of American air power in the region. At 12:35 p.m., they arrived high over Luzon. Below them, American bombers sat lined on the tarmac, unprepared, engines cold. The Bettys flew in perfect formation, sunlight glinting off their narrow fuselages. Then they opened their bomb bay. Within minutes, the sky was raining steel. Runways shattered. Hangars vanished in smoke and dust. 12 of 17 American B-17 flying fortresses were destroyed before they ever took off. Fighters burned in rows. In less than an hour, the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Philippines were effectively erased from the map. The Betty had made its debut, and it was devastating. 2 days later, its legend grew even darker. On December 10, 1941, waves of Bettys and their older cousins, the G4M Nells, found the British warships Prince of Wales and Repulse off the coast of Malaya. They came in low, releasing torpedoes designed for shallow water. The British ships fired desperately, their decks blazing with anti-aircraft guns. But it was useless. One by one, the torpedoes struck home, 6 hits on Prince of Wales, 4 on Repulse. In just 90 minutes, both mighty warships capsized and sank. For the first time in naval history, battleships at sea had been destroyed solely by aircraft. The age of air power had truly begun, and the G4M Betty was its messenger. Across the Pacific, the bomber seemed untouchable. It struck Darwin from 1,500 miles away, hit Port Moresby over the jungled spine of New Guinea, and reached Guadalcanal from Rabaul, hundreds of miles across open ocean. To Allied soldiers, the Betty felt like a ghost that could appear anywhere, at any time. And for a moment, it looked as if Japan had found the perfect weapon, sleek, deadly, unstoppable. But hidden inside that silver fuselage was a secret no amount of success could conceal forever. The cost of that perfection. Every mission, every victory, every glorious photograph of Betty bombers, returning from distant raids, was bought with the same silent risk. One spark, one tracer round, one lucky hit, and the sky would turn into fire. The Betty's triumphs were built on borrowed time, and soon that time would run out. When the Betty first entered full service in 1941, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Sleek, light, and frighteningly efficient, it could fly farther than any other bomber of its time, over 6,000 kilometers without refueling. To the pilots who flew her, the Betty seemed alive, a machine that devoured distance as effortlessly as the wind itself. That range was her power. It was also her curse. Japanese commanders quickly recognized the possibilities. The Betty could strike from Formosa to the Philippines, from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, from the home islands to the edges of the Pacific war zone. It didn't need nearby bases or carriers. It was the reach of the empire itself. Each of its two 1,500 horsepower engines pushed the aircraft through the air like a silver spear. The empty weight, barely 6,700 kilograms, was astonishingly low for a bomber with such wingspan and fuel load. Fully fueled, the Betty carried nearly 5,000 liters of aviation gasoline, stored in thin aluminum tanks that lined her wings from root to tip. That fuel gave her the ability to fly more than 3,700 miles, an unimaginable figure in. It was range bought by stripping away everything that might have saved the crew. There was no armor behind the pilot's seat, no protection around the gunners, no self-sealing compound in the fuel system. Even the oxygen lines and electrical wiring ran beside the tanks, ready to ignite if a bullet struck. The structure was beautiful in its simplicity, a triumph of aerodynamics, but fragile as glass under fire. In Japan's war rooms, range meant strategy. The nation's empire stretched across water, not land. Every major base, Formosa, Saipan, Truk, Rabaul, was an island fortress isolated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Betty was built to bridge those distances. She was the lifeline between islands, fleets, and distant battles. In those early months of the war, the Betty's wings carried not just bombs and torpedoes, but the illusion of invincibility. Her ability to strike beyond the reach of Allied fighters gave Japan a weapon of terror and surprise. Allied airfields burned before anyone could intercept. Ships that believed themselves safe behind miles of ocean suddenly found explosions blooming across their decks. To the Americans and British, it was as if Japan had unlocked a new dimension of warfare, one where distance no longer mattered. But inside the cockpit, Japanese crews already understood the truth. They knew that every extra kilometer of range came at a cost measured in blood. The engines purred beautifully. The controls were responsive, but the thin fuselage was a coffin waiting to ignite. They flew because they were ordered to, because their duty demanded it, not because they believed they would come home. Still, as 1942 unfolded, the Betty's legend grew. Missions that should have been impossible were carried out routinely. The aircraft's endurance reshaped Japan's war plans, giving admirals the confidence to project power across an ocean they once feared to cross. For a few brief months, the Betty seemed unstoppable. the ultimate long-range weapon, the perfect expression of Japan's faith in speed, surprise, and sacrifice. But in war, perfection never lasts. As the Allies adapted, the very qualities that made the Betty so formidable would become the source of its destruction. For when enemy fighters finally met her in the open sky, the distance she once conquered would offer no escape, only a longer road to the fire waiting at journey's end. Every aircraft is born from a series of choices, a constant negotiation between power and weight, speed and strength, life and death. For the Mitsubishi engineers who created the G4M Betty, those choices had been as ruthless as war itself. In the design rooms of Nagoya, equations filled the chalkboards: lift, drag, range, payload. Each number told a story of compromise. Every gram of armor added meant a few kilometers lost. Every layer of self-sealing rubber on a fuel tank meant one less minute of endurance over open ocean. The Betty's creators weren't reckless dreamers. They were coldly pragmatic, and in 1937, their logic seemed sound. Japan was an island empire fighting a war of distances. It could not afford a bomber that was tough but short-legged. It needed a machine that could reach enemies before those enemies could reach Japan. The designers faced a brutal arithmetic. To fly farther, the bomber must weigh less. To weigh less, something had to go. Protection went first. Hiro Honjo, the lead designer, understood what he was doing. He knew that once the Betty faced sustained opposition, the lack of self-sealing tanks would mean death. But he also knew there was no other way to meet the Navy's demands. The mathematics left no mercy. If the bomber carried armor, it couldn't carry enough fuel. If it carried less fuel, it couldn't fulfill Japan's strategic vision to strike enemies from bases beyond their reach. So he made the decision that would define the aircraft forever. No armor plating, no self-sealing tanks, no fire suppression. Every kilogram saved was a kilometer gain. It was engineering by sacrifice. The results were breathtaking on paper. The G4M weighed nearly 2 tons less than its American counterpart, the B-25 Mitchell. It could outrun most Allied fighters of 1941 and reach targets nearly twice as far away. It was, in every measurable sense, a masterpiece of efficiency. But inside, that perfection hid the flaw of its own success. What the engineers gained in distance, they lost in resilience. A single bullet through the wing could ignite the fuel tanks. A single tracer could turn the aircraft into a fireball visible for miles. Crews nicknamed it Hamaki, the cigar, for its long, round shape. Allied pilots called it the Flying Zippo. Everyone knew what happened when it was hit. To Western minds, this trade-off seemed insanity. But to Japan's military planners in 1937, it was a calculated gamble. They believed their pilots would be protected by speed and range, by the element of surprise, by the lack of capable opposition. They imagined a war fought quickly, decisively, before the enemy could grow strong. In that future, the Betty's fragility didn't matter. In that future, the bomber would never have to survive long enough to suffer. But that future was an illusion. The moment the United States began to rebuild its air power, the logic of the Betty unraveled. The aircraft that had once seemed the embodiment of Japanese precision would soon become a symbol of something darker, the cost of trusting perfection too much. Every line of its design whispered the same truth. To go farther, you must give something up. And Japan had given up its crew. By mid-1942, the illusion shattered. The same sleek bomber that had once terrified the Pacific skies was now turning into a death trap for its own crews. The tide of the war had shifted. American factories roared to life, filling the air with new fighters, Wildcats, then Hellcats, and the fearsome Corsairs. Radar networks now warned of incoming raids hours before they arrived. For the first time, Betty formations met an enemy ready to fight. The results were catastrophic. It began at Guadalcanal, where the jungled island became a graveyard for Japanese air power. On August 8, 1942, 23 G4M Betty bombers took off from Rabaul to strike American positions. They never made it home. Over Savo Island, American fighters fell upon them, fast, coordinated, merciless. Within minutes, the sky turned into fire. 18 of the 23 Bettys were shot down. 120 airmen vanished into the sea. For the survivors, it was a horror they could never forget. The Betty didn't just catch fire, it became fire. 2 or 3 hits anywhere along the wing, and the bomber disintegrated in midair. The fuel tanks, unprotected and overfilled, turned the aircraft into flying torches. Some crews tried to bail out, but the flames spread faster than human reaction. Others rode their burning bombers down into the waves, bound by duty or by the futility of escape. From that day on, the Betty was no longer a symbol of reach and power. It was a symbol of fragility, a weapon that demanded everything from its pilots and gave nothing back. American flyers began to hunt it deliberately. "Find the cigars," they'd say over the radio. The Betty was easy to spot, its long fuselage gleaming silver against the cloud. They didn't even need to aim precisely. Hit it anywhere, one pilot recalled, and it will explode. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn, leading his Corsairs at Guadalcanal, wrote in his combat journal, "First time we met the Bettys, we couldn't believe how quickly they went down. You could set one ablaze with a short burst. It was like watching a match catch." For Japanese crews, each mission became an act of fatalism. They knew what awaited them. They knew the odds. When they climbed into the cockpit and adjusted their goggles, they were boarding an aircraft that might not bring them home. The G4M had become both their weapon and their coffin. Reports from the front poured into Tokyo. The numbers were staggering. In just 3 months at Guadalcanal, Japan lost over 100 Betty bombers, hundreds of trained airmen, navigators, radio operators, pilots were gone. Their experience irreplaceable. But even as the losses mounted, missions continued. Japan had no alternative bomber with comparable range. The empire was trapped by its own design philosophy. The Betty's reach was still vital for striking distant Allied positions. But that reach came at the cost of annihilation. It was the cruelest kind of irony. The aircraft that had once opened Japan's war in triumph was now devouring its own air force in flames. And yet, the engineers had done their job perfectly. The Betty was everything it was meant to be: fast, long-legged, deadly at range. Only the assumptions behind it were wrong. Every time one fell, it was not failure of machinery, but the failure of a nation's belief. The belief that speed could replace protection, that range could substitute for survival. By the end of 1942, the Pacific skies were littered with the wreckage of those beliefs. And in the rising smoke over Guadalcanal, Japan's long-range dream was burning itself to ash. By late 1942, the G4M Betty was dying faster than Japan could build it. What had once been the empire's sharpest spear was now a burning trail across the Pacific sky. The statistics told a story that no propaganda could hide. Dozens of Bettys lost in a single week, entire squadrons wiped out in a single sortie. Each mission to Guadalcanal became a funeral procession in waiting, crews climbing into their planes in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon, knowing that horizon might be the last thing they ever saw. In the jungles below, American Marines and sailors began to recognize the sight of falling Bettys. The way they broke apart, the sudden orange blossom of flame, the thin column of black smoke marking another explosion at sea. "You could always tell when a Betty got hit," one Marine later said. "It didn't just go down, it disappeared." From August through October 1942, the pattern never changed. Betty bombers lifted off from Rabaul, flew 600 miles to Guadalcanal, and were met by swarms of Hellcats and Wildcats waiting for them. Every flight ended the same way: streaks of fire across the sky, wreckage scattered across the ocean. One pilot in McCoy's intelligence report described the sound, the hollow boom, when a Betty's fuel tanks erupted, the thunder that echoed even miles away. To the Americans, it was the sound of victory. To the Japanese, it was the sound of sacrifice. By November 1942, Japan had lost more than 100 Bettys over Guadalcanal alone, and with them, nearly 700 men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners. Some had been among the finest aviators in the Imperial Navy, veterans of the early victories who had struck Clark Field and sunk the Prince of Wales. Their loss was more than numbers, it was the slow erasure of experience, the collapse of an elite air arm, built over a decade. And still, the missions continued. Even as American radar grew sharper and fighter coverage expanded, Japanese commanders ordered new raids. Each time, the outcome was the same. The sky turned into fire, and the ocean into graves. The attrition was merciless. By December, some air groups were down to a handful of flyable aircraft. Replacement crews arrived barely trained. Young men with desperate eyes, their first mission almost certain to be their last. In Tokyo, engineers and officers studied the reports. They saw the numbers, the patterns, the losses that defied logic. They knew the cause: unprotected fuel tanks. No armor, no chance once hit. But Japan's industry was stretched to the breaking point. There was no capacity to redesign, no time to retool factories. The Betty remained the only bomber capable of reaching the far edges of the empire. It had to fly, no matter how many men it consumed. Every mission became an act of faith in a machine that no longer deserved it. Crews taped family photographs to the instrument panels. Some carried tiny charms from home. Most didn't expect to use them. They flew anyway, because honor demanded it, because their empire asked it, because their commanders believed that devotion could fill the space where armor should have been. To American pilots, the Betty was easy meat. To Japanese pilots, it was destiny, beautiful, doomed, and inescapable. By early 1943, the Pacific had become a graveyard of Betty bombers. Shattered wings washed up on coral reefs. Oil slicks glimmered in the sun where squadrons had vanished. The aircraft that once ruled the skies now symbolized a terrible truth: that courage could not overcome design, and that no amount of loyalty could save men from the physics of fire. The G4M had given Japan the power to strike far and fast. Now it was exacting payment, in blood, in bodies, in silence. And still, somewhere in a hangar or a jungle airstrip, another crew climbed aboard, checked their instruments, and took off into the endless blue. By 1943, the truth was undeniable. The G4M Betty was a masterpiece built for the wrong war. Its glory had been consumed by its own design, and Japan's airmen were dying faster than engineers could sketch their replacements. Something had to change. At Mitsubishi's plants in Nagoya, the surviving designers gathered in silent urgency. Reports from the front filled their desks: technical analyses, combat losses, pilot testimonies written in restrained but desperate tones. One line appeared again and again: the aircraft burns too easily. The engineers already knew why. They had known since 1939. The Betty's great secret, its unprotected fuel tanks, was now an open wound. The men who had once celebrated the bomber's long legs and light frame now faced the arithmetic of death. Their choices had created, so they began to modify what they could. Starting in March 1943, the 63rd aircraft to roll off the line carried a quiet change. Sheets of 30mm rubber mounted beneath the wings, a desperate attempt to slow the leaks when enemy bullets punctured the tanks. It wasn't real armor, and it wasn't real self-sealing protection. It was a bandage on a mortal wound. The change cost precious range, about 300 kilometers lost, and a few points of top speed, but the difference in survival was almost non-existent. The rubber could delay fuel loss from small caliber hits, but it couldn't stop fires from cannon shells or tracers. The Betty still burned. The men still died. By 1944, as the war turned against Japan on every front, Engineers tried again. The G4M3, introduced that October, was their final effort to save the design. For the first time, it featured true self-sealing fuel tanks. At last, the bomber could withstand a few hits without instantly becoming an inferno. But the solution came at a heavy price. Literally, the new tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 liters, cutting maximum range by nearly 2,000 kilometers. The very feature that had defined the Betty, her ability to cross oceans, was gone, and Japan, cornered and desperate, no longer had the luxury of long-range missions. The skies themselves were shrinking. American carriers, once distant threats, now surrounded the home islands. Allied fighters could reach almost anywhere. Only 60 of the G4M3s were built before the end. A few reached squadrons, but it no longer mattered. The Betty's time was over. The skies belonged to the Americans now, filled with B-29s that could rain destruction from heights no Japanese fighter could touch. In those final months, the Betty became a ghost of its former self. Obsolete, yet still flying, it carried reconnaissance crews, supply officers, sometimes even suicide weapons. One of its last missions was the most tragic of all. In March 1945, 18 Bettys took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying a desperate weapon, the MXY-7 Oka, a manned rocket bomb, a human missile. The Bettys were to fly within 20 kilometers of the American fleet, release the Okas, and turn back. But they never got that far. American Hellcats intercepted the formation long before the release point. The heavy rockets beneath their bellies made the Bettys slow and clumsy. One by one, they exploded. 18 bombers, 137 crewmen, 15 kamikaze pilots, all gone before a single weapon could be launched. It was the final proof that nothing could save this machine. Not armor, not courage, not sacrifice. The Betty story had come full circle. What began as a symbol of range and precision ended as a weapon of desperation. By the summer of 1945, only a few Bettys remained operational. They were no longer feared. They were relics, symbols of a war Japan had already lost. And yet, in the end, one last act of symbolism awaited the bomber that had started it all. Its final flight would not carry bombs or torpedoes or human weapons. It would carry peace. August 1945. The fires had burned themselves out. Japan's cities lay in ruins. Its fleets lay at the bottom of the sea, and the sky that once belonged to the rising sun now belonged to no one at all. The war was over, though the air still trembled with the echo of it. And then, fittingly, it was the Betty that appeared again. On August 19, 1945, two Mitsubishi G4M bombers took off from Atsugi Air Base, near Tokyo. But this time, they were not the polished green predators that had once darkened the skies over the Pacific. These were painted pure white, with large green crosses on their wings and fuselages, symbols of surrender. Their call signs were Baton 1 and Baton 2. The name was not chosen lightly. It was a deliberate echo of April 1942, when American troops had surrendered to Japan on the Bataan Peninsula, one of the empire's proudest victories. Now, the tables had turned, and Japan itself was making the long flight into surrender. Inside the lead aircraft sat members of the Japanese delegation, carrying the first documents of peace. Their destination was Iishima, a small island near Okinawa, where they would transfer to an American C-54 transport bound for Manila. The irony was unmistakable. The same aircraft that had opened the Pacific War by destroying Clark Field in the Philippines was now flying back toward the same land, stripped of guns, painted white, and humbled beyond recognition. To the American pilots assigned to escort them, the sight was surreal. The white Bettys floated through the humid air, gleaming like ghosts, the last remnants of an air force that had once threatened half the world. The fighters circled protectively, not to shoot them down, but to make sure they followed the prescribed course. The escorts were both guardians and wardens. In the cockpits of the Bettys, silence reigned. There were no battle cries, no chatter on the radios, No sense of triumph, only the sound of engines, engines that had once carried fire, now carrying a nation's surrender. The pilots wore their dress uniforms instead of flight suits. The bomb bays were empty. The machine guns had been removed. Only the aircraft itself remained, the same thin-skinned, fragile construction that Major McCoy had examined months before at Clark Field. As they crossed the Pacific, the symbolism deepened. The Betty had come full circle. The weapon that had started the war was now ending it. It was, in a way, a final act of mercy, a recognition that the same machine that had carried so much death could, at last, carry peace. But to those who built it, to those who flew it, the flight was also a quiet eulogy, a funeral for every crewman who had burned in the sky, for every mission that ended in fire, for every dream of a perfect aircraft that had turned to ash. When Baton 1 and Baton 2 touched down at Aishima, American soldiers watched them taxi across the runway. The white paint glistened under the tropical sun, the green crosses bright against the scorched concrete. For a moment, the scene felt unreal, as if time had folded in on itself. The bomber that had once been the embodiment of Japanese power was now the messenger of its defeat. A few days later, those same planes were photographed from every angle. Just as McCoy had done with tail number 76, the Americans understood the poetry of it. The Betty had begun the war by erasing an airfield in the Philippines. It ended the war by landing, intact, on another airfield. This time, under the flag of peace. The circle was closed, and in that strange, quiet moment, the Betty's story, one written in ambition, brilliance, and blood, finally reached its last page. The White Bettys that carried Japan's surrender delegation did more than end a war. They closed a circle of tragedy that had begun 8 years earlier in a design room in Nagoya. When their engines finally fell silent on the tarmac of Ieshima, so too did an idea. The belief that range and speed could outweigh protection and survival. When American engineers later studied the captured aircraft, they were astonished once again. The numbers spoke plainly. The G4M's fuel tanks were made of thin aluminum, barely 2 millimeters thick, holding nearly 5,000 liters of volatile fuel. The math was unforgiving. Every kilogram of armor left behind had become a kilometer of range gained. Every meter flown had been paid for with a crewman's life. The Betty's designers hadn't failed. They had succeeded too well. They had built exactly what their nation had demanded: a bomber that could reach farther, fly faster, and carry heavier payloads than anything else in the sky. It was Japan's most efficient weapon, and its most merciless. But war doesn't forgive beautiful logic. In the end, the Betty became a symbol of the fatal difference between two philosophies. The Allies built machines to bring men home. The Japanese built machines to complete the mission, no matter the cost. For the United States, a bomber crew was an investment, trained, armored, and expected to survive. For Japan, a bomber crew was an expendable instrument of imperial will. That difference defined the air war over the Pacific. American B-17s and B-24s were slower, heavier, and clumsier, but they endured. They could take hits, lose engines, limp home on shredded wings. Their self-sealing tanks and armor plating weighed tons, yet those tons bought lives. Crews climbed out of crumpled fortresses with smoke-blackened faces and shaking hands, but alive. Japanese crews rarely had that chance. A hit that would scar a B-17 would annihilate a Betty. By 1945, the results were visible across the Pacific. The skies once filled with silver Japanese bombers were empty. Out of more than 2,400 Bettys built, only a handful remained. Thousands of airmen, fathers, brothers, sons, had burned inside those fragile machines. When the war ended, Major McCoy's photographs of tail number 7631-12 became part of the official Allied intelligence archives. His notes were clinical, but between the lines, one could feel his disbelief. "This aircraft is not poorly designed," he wrote. "It is designed for a doctrine that assumes no one survives." The Betty's legacy was not just technical, it was moral. It forced engineers and strategists to confront the human cost hidden within every line of a blueprint. The bomber's perfection had been purchased with its crew's lives. It stood as proof that technological brilliance divorced from compassion leads only to ruin. Years later, survivors who had flown the Betty would remember her with a kind of reverent sorrow. One former petty officer said it best. She was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for her range. We flew because it was our duty, and we died because that was what she was built to make us do. In museums and photographs, the Betty remains sleek, beautiful, her curves almost serene, her form timeless. But for those who know her story, that beauty hides a haunting truth. The G4M Betty was never just an airplane. It was an idea made flesh, the embodiment of a nation's dream and its fatal blindness. It taught the world a final, unshakable lesson. Performance means nothing if no one lives to see it. And so, when the white-painted Bettys of August 1945 descended toward peace, they carried more than diplomats. They carried the weight of every man who had burned in the sky before them, and the quiet, enduring reminder that victory bought with human lives is no victory at all.